Here's one of the other things that is going on right now that you asked about and that is really important, and I'm gonna add something to it that you didn't ask about that is also very important. You asked if he has the power to fire the member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Lisa Cook, the way he did last night. And the answer to that, once again, is Trump is obfuscating. That is, under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the governors can be removed for cause, and that's the only way that they described it. And historically, that has been assumed to mean malfeasance, corruption, dereliction of duty, something that has to do with their jobs. Now, one of the things that the Trump administration does is it has put into the federal housing, I forget the next two words of it, um, agency, a loyalist, a guy whose last name is Pulte, Matthew Pulte, I believe it is. And what he has been doing is he has been accusing prominent Democrats of mortgage fraud. Now, this is incredibly uncommon, but it's also something that shows up a lot in political campaigns, in opposition research. And so he accused Lisa Cook of of putting bad information down on a mortgage years ago, and has taken that to the Department of Justice, as also has been taken a similar case against um, New York Attorney General Letitia James and California Senator Adam Schiff. And, these really look trumped up. They really look like they are just a way to launch investigations and muddy the reputations of these people. In any case, although Lisa Cook has never been charged with anything, that accusation probably doesn't fall under the traditional understanding of being fired for cause. Now, here's another piece of that. I'm going to come back to this. There has been since 1935 a case law under a Supreme Court decision of 1935 that said that the President of the United States does not have the power to remove the heads of agencies that have been set up by Congress. Now, in May of this year, the Supreme Court suggested that it was going to overturn that and was going to give the president power to do that in order to gut the federal government the way that the extremists on the Supreme Court want. But when they did that, they said the Federal Reserve is different. You can go ahead and get rid of the head of the National Labor Relations Board, but you cannot get rid of the head of the Fed and the people who make up the Fed, for the simple reason that they had some historical argument that was kind of not convincing to a lot of people, including the other three justices, for why the Fed was different. But the reason that they did that is because the Federal Reserve oversees the economy of the United States of America, and it oversees monetary policy. So, and it is supposed to be completely independent because you don't want politicians messing around with that. Donald Trump desperately wants the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. And the reason he wants them to lower interest rates is because when interest rates are lower, people are more willing to borrow money. And if they're more willing to borrow money, they're more willing to spend money, and that gooses the economy. So it heats up much faster. But the problem with that, and he wants that desperately because the economy, as you know, has been really dramatically slowing down since Trump took office, in part because of the instability of everything he's doing, in part because of the tariffs, in part because he's tossing so many people out of the country, especially the agricultural workers and the housing workers. But the economy is really grinding to a halt. So he wants the Fed to lower interest rates so people will have more money. But the Fed is also very concerned about inflation because people don't want to pay a lot more money for their goods. And if you have taken a peek at the grocery stores lately, and I just got to put a plug in here for coffee, the prices are eye-popping. You're really starting to see inflation taking off from the tariffs and from the deportations. And so the Fed doesn't want to lower interest rates because it drives up inflation. Not always, but it usually drives up inflation. So Trump has been desperate to get rid of the head of the Fed, a guy named Jerome Powell, whom he appointed and then Biden reappointed. because Powell has said, "Listen, I'm not gonna mess with the interest rates right now." And he has backed off on Powell. Um, do you remember when he was doing, you might have seen it on the news, they were the 2 men wearing hard hats, and you might not have known who Powell was. And Trump goes, "This building is running way over, the amount of money it was supposed to take." And Powell, the guy who's Powell, looks at him and goes, "What are you talking about?" And Trump goes, "Yeah, I just got these numbers." And Powell looks Powell says, "Let me see that." And he looks at the piece of paper, and he goes, "You're putting in a building that was finished 5 years ago." And Trump's like, "Oh, well," and then he goes on to something else. But Trump was trying to set Powell up, again, for malfeasance of some sort, to get rid of him. And when that backfired on him, he went after Lisa Cook. Now, Lisa Cook, as the one of the board of governors, she was a professor of economics and international affairs, I think it was. And then she was on the Federal Reserve Board of the Bank of Chicago, the Chicago Federal Bank. And now, I'm sorry, I'm tired, so the words aren't really going the way they normally do. And then Biden appointed her to the Federal Reserve Board in 2022. And she is the first Black woman on that board. So she was also the person who, after the last set of jobs numbers came back as poorly as they did, came back as bad as they did, said, "Hey, this might be a turning point for the economy." So last night on True Social, that's a real man's man, right? He's like, I'm this great strong man, and instead of having a conversation with somebody, I'm going to post it on social media. Anyway, on social media, he posted a letter saying he was firing her. And so the question is, and this will almost certainly go into the courts, but possibly all the way to the Supreme Court. Will the Supreme Court say to him, "No, you can't do this"? Because they've said no to him almost never. The Supreme Court, the lower courts say no to him a lot. But if they give Trump control over the Fed, over monetary policy, as Paul Krugman put it this morning in his newsletter, we're going to look like Turkey, where authoritarian took over federal policy and they had 80% inflation. I mean, it's just not a good idea. So they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in answer to your question of whether or not he can do it. And a lot of people who probably support him for things like tax cuts do not want this guy in charge of federal monetary policy. Now, there's another piece of that you didn't ask about that is also very important, and that's that those same people who care about the stability of the American economy, I mean, we all do, but those who are investors in it have got to be paying attention to the fact that Trump is taking pieces of companies. So you've asked about the fact that he has taken a 10% cut of Intel. And just to be clear, the U.S. didn't buy that. He hit them up for that, in order to, he was threatening the CEO with saying that he should be fired. CEO had a conversation with him, and Trump said, "I think the U.S. should have 10% of your company." And he's like, "Cool." And so theoretically, the U.S. now owns 10% of Intel. What does that mean? Who has control of that? But more importantly, for the larger picture here, if you are an investor or an industry, somebody who cares about industry, or a business person, years, decades of screaming that any kind of regulation of business was somehow a form of socialism, and socialism is a system by which the government takes the means of production. You are literally looking at Trump taking pieces of companies. There go free markets right out the window. All of a sudden, what your business does depends on not even what a group of people want, but what this Looney Tunes guy in the White House wants. So in terms of Trump being able to cement his power and become this authoritarian, he's actually not making a lot of friends, even among the groups that should be friendly to him. That is business people, for example. And he's also offending people like those who voted for him because he promised to make IVF free. As you know, he has not only not done that, the government is now looking at stopping IVF.